Right. Okay. Is the text visible now? Is it?
Yes, properly.
Right. Okay. So today's lecture concentrates on the dedicatory epistle to the poem, the conditions in which the poem was written, and, if possible, the invocation of this mock heroic. Now, in 1711, Pope was approximately 22, 23 years old. And as I pointed out, due to the Test Act, Roman Catholics were barred from public office or joining the court. Therefore, Pope was part of this Catholic fraternity, which was largely relegated to the outskirts of London, across the River Thames. In fact, he took up residence in Twickenham in the last part of his life. So also was a gentleman called Lord Peter, who would have otherwise become part of the House of Lords, but could not because of his Catholic lineage. There was also a young woman called Arabella Fermor, a young noblewoman, who was recognized as one of the great beauties of the period. Now, in one of these gatherings, these social aristocratic gatherings, please remember that the context of the Rape of the Lock is aristocratic. It is a poem which belongs fairly and squarely within the gentry. That around 1712, in a social gathering, Lord Peter actually cut off one of the locks of hair of Arabella Fermor. Now, this created a tremendous social brawl between the two families, and other Catholic families also got involved. So point number one to be understood is that the Catholics were a fraternity who were marginalized. Point number two is that within the aristocratic community, there erupted a scandal about Lord Peter cutting off the lock of hair of one Arabella Fermor, who was another noblewoman. This created a major social scandal, bad blood between the two families, and the other Catholic families also got involved. So within the marginalized Catholic community, there was the potential of a great feud erupting. Now, in stepped a man called John Caryll, who was a publisher and a poet also, who asked the young Pope to write a poem which would dissolve this quarrel into laughter. So write a mock heroic whereby this entire feud could be made comical, and therefore it could be dismissed and dissolved. This was the immediate context of the writing of the poem. Please remember that the word rape in this context is used from rapier, which would broadly mean violation. And the poem has shades of, obviously, the Homeric poems and the abduction and therefore violation of Helen of Troy. Now, whenever this association is made, we will also have to remember the way in which Helen was very often framed as a femme fatale, as a fatal woman, as somebody who caused the war between two kingdoms, and female beauty as something which was inherently dangerous. Therefore, there are, within the heroic comical structure, a number of deeper shades that come through, especially in the violence and violation of the body as well as the lock that the title suggests. Also remember that the title is metonymic in the sense that the hair, the lock, stands for the whole of the body. In that sense, it is also the violation of Belinda's personality, selfhood, or whatever you call it, even though it might have been in jest. Now, Pope, as I pointed out in the earlier discussion, was or shared some of his age's misogynist ideas. He saw women as inherently narcissistic and concerned only with their own appearance and beauty. And he considered, and as he was to later on write in one of his satires, women as promiscuous. He wrote, "Most women have no character at all." This is a line that Pope actually writes. Every woman is at heart a rake. And he was also part and parcel of a post-Restoration aristocratic society where idleness, celebration, promiscuity was encouraged within courtly life. And he was looking at also the rapid rise of a colonial merchant class, which was fast challenging the primacy of the gentry. Therefore, in a certain way, there are two operative satires in this poem. One is the satire against female vanity in the female absorption with beauty and narcissistic selfhood. On the other hand, there's also the satire against the aristocratic life of idleness and leisure which the people were leading at this period. Therefore, these are the twin satires that I think the Rape of the Lock would bring together, apart from the very local, topical satire of a trivial episode like the cutting of a lock of hair blowing up into a major social scandal. So this is the history of the writing of the poem. Now, as you can see, I have taken Geoffrey Tillotson's edition of The Rape of the Lock. It's a heroic comical poem in 5 cantos. Now, the composition of The Rape of the Lock was also very interesting. In canto number, in the 1712 edition, which was the first edition of The Rape of the Lock, Pope only had 2 cantos, right? Pope only had 2 cantos which talked about the moment when the lock was cut off. In the 1714 edition, Pope had 3 cantos. He had added, therefore, a canto, and he had added this entire journey by the barge, by the royal barge to the Hampton Court, and he had also added the entire supernatural machinery to the poem. The supernatural machinery constituting of the sylphs, who are coquettes, that is, unmarried narcissistic women like Belinda, who have died unmarried and have passed on to the other world to become very pretty sylphs who hover around Belinda and guard her chastity. Now, it is very interesting also, just a small information for all of you. In 1715, Lord Peter married another aristocratic lady who was quite younger than himself. Therefore, he married off. Belinda also, Arabella Fermor, the Belinda of the poem, was also married off pretty early, and she went on to become the mother of 5 children. Lord Peter died early. Belinda died much later on. So in a sense, there's also a suggestion about, the rape being also the violation of the body. Therefore, there's a strong suggestion of sexuality and of the fact that why did Arabella allow her hair to be cut off? Was she amorously inclined towards Lord Peter? There are these questions of sexuality also lurking under the surface of the poem. So the poem, has a large number of dimensions. The first dimension is its mock heroic trivialization. The epic context of the rape of the Helen is trivialized by the trivial, cutting of the lock of hair of Belinda. So trivialization. As I argued in my last class, there's a complete feminization of the epic. Therefore, the entire world of Achilles or Hector or Troy becomes converted into the feminine world of Belinda. The ringing plains of windy Troy are transferred to the bedrooms and the courtrooms of Belinda's circle. So a feminization of the epic, trivialization, feminization, and there is also a kind of a satirization of the entire world of the nobility as such, right? So these are the ways in which the poem operates. Now, there are two things over the course of this poem which I'll target and which I'll discuss because it becomes relevant to us, is how is the woman framed in the Rape of the Lock? Or what are the varieties of womanhood that Pope presents in the Rape of the Lock? Right? Why introduce the sylphs in the 1714 edition? Not only that, from the three-canto version of 1714, Pope also added two more cantos in the third edition of 1717. And this is where he comes across as presenting Canto 4, which is about the Cave of Spleen, where he talks about female hysteria, and Canto 5, the conclusion of the poem, where he includes the speech of Clarissa, who is Belinda's maid, but who offers a moral lesson to Belinda, as it were. And the lesson is that, we as women must preserve good honor, and we must, surrender to men and marry so that, whatever our beauty is, we can utilize it when we can, right? So Clarissa will later on argue, and this is a passage I'll read in great detail with you, since painted or not painted, all shall fade, and she who scorns a man must die a maid. So all makeup will ultimately fade, you will become old. So if you scorn a man, you will die a maid, right? So the interesting part of the poem, therefore, is also its publication history. Why was Pope adding on to the poems? 1712, he publishes a two-canto version. 1714, a three-canto version. With the sylphs added in, why does he add the sylphs is an important question. And 1717, he adds Clarissa's speech, two more cantos, moral ending to the poem. Why does he do so? What does it reflect on his attitude towards women? And the other question that comes across, and we shall point it out to you, is the sheer number of commodities and objects in the Rape of the Lock. Now, this you will have to understand, because the Rape of the Lock is written almost 120 years after, or not 120, 110 years after, the first East India Company has already arrived in Ceylon. And the East India Company has established its trade. London is one of the primary trading centers of Europe, and colonial riches are pouring in to England. So much so that London is becoming the center of the universe. Now, what are these objects? And what do they reflect about Pope's stance towards colonialism? Is he ratifying it? Is he celebrating it? Is he criticizing it? I'm going to argue that Belinda's dressing table and the objects all around her are indexes of the reality of colonialism and the prosperity of England in the 18th century. So there are two issues which I take up, apart from the satire, the mock heroic. One is, how is Pope looking at this question of the woman and the varieties of womanhood? One. And two, how is Pope looking at the question of colonialism and the world of colonial objects? Right. So you see the introduction comes from Marshall, and the line can be translated as, I was loth, Belinda, to violate your locks, but I am pleased to have granted that much to your pleasure. And it is here that Pope writes a dedicatory epistle to Mrs. Arabella Fermor. I want you to read this carefully. He says, Madam, it will be in vain to deny that I have some regard for this piece since I dedicate it to you. You may bear me witness it was intended. This is the intention. Whenever you have this text, underline this. It was intended only to divert a few young ladies. So delight, diversion is delight. Remember the Horatian dictum that poetry instructs while pleasing. So part of this poem is to delight the young ladies, but who have good sense and good humor enough to laugh not only at their sex's little unguarded follies, but at their own. So there's also a moral to this poem. What is the moral? That this is a poem which establishes good humor, good sense among young ladies who are vain about their own beauty, right? The sex's little unguarded follies, right? So Pope is suggesting that woman, or this entire category of the female, is marked by a certain folly. What is that folly? Vanity in their own beauty, right? Therefore, female vanity becomes the subject of the satire. And of course, also to laugh this matter out of the quarrel, out of court. So it has one relevance for Belinda and Lord Peter, so that it can dissolve the quarrel. And secondly, it has equally another intention of making young women aware of their follies, of their vanities about their own beauty, and thereby rectifying them. So diversion, delight, as also the moral of the poem. But as it was communicated with the air of a secret, it soon found its way into the world. Remember that the first two cantos were published anonymously, and thereafter Pope's authorship was discovered, and the poem quickly became a bestseller. It sold a large number of copies, almost 1,000 copies in 2 weeks, and therefore was largely instrumental, along with the essay on criticism, in establishing Pope's reputation as a poet. An imperfect copy having been offered to a bookseller, you had the good nature for my sect to consent to the publication of one more correct. This I was forced to before I had executed half by design. For the machinery was entirely wanting to complete it. Right. So Pope is writing this in 1714. This is the dedicatory epistle when the machinery has been brought in. And what is this machinery? The machinery is this entire presentation of the sylphs and the gnomes, the creatures or the supernatural creatures from fairy lore and Pope's invention. Now, where did Pope get this from? Pope was actually depending upon two poets, two mock heroic poems which went before him. One, as I pointed out, was Boileau's, the French poet Boileau's Les Lutrines. Les Lutrines, L-U-T-R-I-N. Les is Ellie. Les Lutrines, Boileau's Les Lutrines, which was the story of a comic battle between the rival poets. And their battle was by throwing books and pages at each other. So once again, a mock heroic. This was to be the model for Swift's Battle of the Books later on. And the other was a poem, another mock heroic by a man called Samuel Garth, Garth, Samuel Garth, which was titled The Dispensary. The Dispensary being the mock heroic report of a battle between rival schools of physicians, doctors. So doctors hurling medicines at one another. This was another mock heroic poem which Pope used. And in both these cases, Pope was borrowing the supernatural machinery and the mock heroic technique from them. Right. So the machinery, madam, he says, is a term invented by critics to signify that part which the deities, angels, demons are made to act in a poem. Remember that the epic constituted of the gods and the men coming together to engage in battle. Therefore, the natural and the supernatural would merge in the epic. Similarly, he says, I have brought in the machinery which constitutes the demons, the angels, or the deities. But in this case, they are miniaturized. They are miniaturized. They become very small. Right. Now, Pope is also falling back, as I will later on argue when I discuss the sylphs, on the legends of fairies and elves. You will remember the story of the shoemaker and the 7 elves, small creatures who sort of made the shoes for the shoemaker and made him rich. Right. Therefore, the shoemaker, you have this legend of Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, you have the legend of the fairies. So Pope was bringing in the supernatural mock heroic machinery of the epic. He was bringing in elements of the mock epic, and he was also bringing in elements of fairy lore and the indigenous myths. Right, this becomes the source of his machinery. These machines I have determined to raise on a very new and odd foundation, the Rosicrucian doctrine of spirits. Now, I will not go into the Rosicrucian doctrine of spirits right now. When I come to the sylphs, I will discuss this further. And then he says, he explains the Rosicrucians, and he talks about the French book, Le Conte de Gavilis, and he talks about his own supernatural minute creatures, which are based on the 4 elements, he says. The salamanders, the gnomes, these are from the element of earth, the sylphs, whose habitation is in the air, and of course, he talks about the nymphs, which operate in the sea. So salamander, fire, nymph, water, you have the gnomes of the earth and the sylphs of the air. So the 4 elements, which led to the 4 humors also in humorous comedies, are here transformed into the 4 supernatural elements, the salamanders, the gnomes, the sylphs, and the nymphs. Right, so Pope is creating a kind of a supernatural structure to add to the satire of the poem, and also to facilitate the mock heroic. Just in the epic, you had the gods, in the demons, in the mock heroic, you had the sylphs, the gnomes, the nymphs, and the salamanders. As to the following cantos, all the passages of them are as fabulous as the vision in the beginning or the transformation in the end. The human persons are as fictitious as the airy ones. And the character of Belinda, now the Belinda referred to at this point of time, the word Belle, B-E-L-L-E, referred to, was the French version of the young, beautiful woman, La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. You will later on read in Keats, the beautiful woman without pity. So Belinda was the archetypal generic name of the young, beautiful woman. So the human persons are as fictitious as the airy ones, he says. So he's protecting himself from the charge of libel. And he says the character of Belinda, as it is now managed, resembles you nothing but in beauty. But please also remember, part of Pope's satire is also to make Belinda extremely beautiful. Now, in Pope, satire operates together with great beauty. Now, Belinda is no ordinary woman. She's described just as epic heroes and heroines are in terms of the hyperbole. Now, I'm sure you know what the hyperbole is: exaggeration. Let me give you an example. Belinda smiled and the world was gay. So, therefore, it is an extraordinary beauty that Belinda possesses. So he says, the character of Belinda resembles you. He's flattering Arabella Fermor at this point of time, that just as you are the supreme beauty, the character of Belinda is that of one of the greatest epic beauty. So if there is trivialization and feminization, there's also a great beautification. There's a great element of aestheticization that is happening, that the aesthetics of the poem that Pope is presenting is one of a world of glittering objects, a world of great, almost sublime beauty. Now, this is where this poem becomes an example of Horatian satire, because it brings these diverse elements into one body. You remember the term satura and the way we described it as a mixture, a motley. So Pope is bringing in the world of feminization, satirization, is bringing the world of aesthetics also. Right? If this poem has had many graces as there are in your person or in your mind, I could never hope it should pass through the world half so uncensured as you have done. And then he says, Madam, your most humble servant, Alexander Pope. Now the point remains, what has Pope done in this dedicatory epistle? Pope has suggested that the intention of the poem was to laugh away this quarrel, first and foremost. Secondly, he has suggested that this is to divert the ladies, as well as make them aware of the follies of their own sex, the vanities of their own sex. Therefore, this poem is not only delightful, but it also includes a certain moral satire on women. Right? It is also talked about the machinery that he has added, and Pope considers this extremely important. Please remember that he had asked the essayist Joseph Addison for his opinion about the machinery, and Joseph Addison had asked him to delete it. Pope went ahead nevertheless, and later on would mock Addison as a jealous poet in the character of Atticus. This was subsequently in one of his satires. But therefore, Pope is also highlighting the delight and craft with which he has described these sylphs, and we'll see why. Because the moments of great aestheticization in the poem are also done through the sylphs. So they add a kind of aesthetic glamour, a kind of aesthetic dimension, a different level of beauty, as it were, to the poem. And then, of course, he praises Arabella Fermor, and he suggests that the poem is not merely about her, but also is about the great beauty that she possesses. And this is where also Pope is drawing attention to this satire being an object of great aesthetic merit, that there is the art of crafting the beautiful female world of Belinda. Let me then come across once again what Pope has done. Pope has trivialized the epic. There's no doubt about that. But he's done this trivialization, he's done this mock heroic by transforming the masculine world of the epic into the feminine world of Belinda. So he's also feminized the epic. And the craft of Pope lies in the fact that every single detail in this poem has a kind of an epic parallel. So it's replaced every epic mote, every epic detail with its corresponding feminine trivial detail in the Rape of the Lock. This is point number one. So it's an act of substitution. It's an act of trivialization, but substitution, a very careful act. Secondly, he has added great beauty to the world of this feminine Belinda, that it is not a world which is shorn of beauty. It is a world which is extremely aesthetic. It is a world which is filled with great exaggerated beauty. And it is a world filled with a riot of colors. And we'll see how, Pope is bringing in optics and the science of light, especially refraction, which was discovered by Newton earlier into the poem, and how light is being refracted and disported within the poem. So the poem is suffused with a sublimity, with a kind of a beauty that is iridescent, right? And we'll look at these issues later on. But thirdly also, Pope is bringing into the Rape of the Lock, adding to its beauty by objects which are being taken from the colonial areas. For example, silver, glass, tea, mirrors, jewels, perfumes, combs, hair clips. Every single object on Belinda's dressing table is loaded with colonial overtones. So just as he is celebrating Belinda's beauty, he's also in a certain way celebrating the riches that colonialism has brought into England. So it is not merely Belinda that we will be talking about. We'll also suggest that in decking Belinda up, in decorating Belinda up, Pope is also substituting the English national body, right? There'll be an image in the Rape of the Lock, and I'll draw your attention to it, where Belinda will wear on her white breast a silver cross. Now, these are very loaded images. There's a lot of sexuality involved also, but that image of Belinda's white body represents the whiteness of 18th century English society. And that silver cross is representative of the Christian faith. So Christian England, plundering the Afric's and Asia's sable sons to bring together a world of fabulous riches and beauty. And therefore, you have to understand that when we are talking about this rape of Belinda, we are also somewhere have recognized the dark undertones of colonial violence and rape that was being unleashed in Africa and Asia. So I am going to suggest that we are not reading the Rape of the Lock merely as a poem which recognizes a certain cutting off of the lock of hair of a certain aristocratic woman by a certain aristocratic man. We're going to read the Rape of the Lock as an experiment in mock heroic, as one of the greatest Horatian satires ever written, with a combination of beauty, satire, sexuality, aesthetics, feminization. We are also going to read the Rape of the Lock as contemporary, as a representation of contemporary attitudes towards women and versions of womanhood and patriarchal fantasies about versions of womanhood, fears, anxieties, and fantasies. And we are also going to look at the Rape of the Lock as a poem which celebrates colonialism and celebrates English colonialism, but also in a very, very subtle way recognizes the latent violations and violence that this process of colonization involved. So what I've done today is, in today's lecture, is talked about the composition of the poem. I have talked about the context of its writing. I have talked about the publication history of the Rape of the Lock, how it was subsequently enlarged. And I've talked about the underlying issues by a very close examination of the dedicatory epistle to Arabella Ferber. In our next discussion, we shall plunge straight into the first canto of the text. And that is a class that will have to wait for tomorrow. With that, I will stop the recording right now.